Time to talk wide receivers. Is this class maybe understood, maybe overrated, maybe it is underrated? We're going to get Matt Hicks's thoughts as we walk through the profiles of the prospects that are coming up here in the 2025 NFL draft. Matt, we did the running backs. You absolutely crushed it. No doubt you're going to crush the wide receiver position as well. I am going to kick it off, though, with maybe a question that sometimes we slide into the conversation a little bit later in the show, but who's the most misunderstood wide receiver in this class?
That's a very good question right off the bat. The most misunderstood wide receiver in this class for me, I think, is probably, I mean, we can't say Travis Hunter, right? I think it's Jalen Noel, and I'm so glad that folks have started to catch on to him, but that's somebody who I've been shouting from the rooftops on for a while, a really underrated type guy. I think that he's a first-round draft pick, quite honestly, a first-round NFL draft pick, if not a top 50 draft pick. Really good hands, fast as we saw at the combine, good athleticism, really kind of wins over the middle of the field, and has really sharp route running ability, which gives him some good versatility, excellent first step, separates consistently through his routes. So in terms of just being misunderstood, not being hyped up enough, I have to lead with my guy, Jalen Noel.
Well, that's good because there is another kind of a question topic on him later in the show. So we'll get to talk a little bit more about him as the conversation moves along. Is there a wide receiver in this class, either from the high side or the low side, that analysts are definitely going to miss on by just looking at the numbers?
Yeah, just looking at the numbers here, I think that you're going to be a little misconstrued on... what really throws me off here is the two TCU wide receivers. And that to me are the guys who I have found are consistently ranked higher than I would like to see. Jack Bech had good production at TCU, but I struggle to see him fitting into an NFL offense in terms of a high volume role. I'd love to see him on my NFL offense. My favorite NFL team. I think he's a really nice wide receiver 3, but I think folks are very excited about both his production and his analytical profile. And then the same thing with Savion Williams. And I think Savion Williams is a really good example of a guy who, has really good athleticism and production at the college level. But one thing I talk about each and every year that you want to be really conscious of when you're drafting a rookie wide receiver is was their production at the college level manufactured? And when I say that, I'm talking about targets near the line of scrimmage, handoffs behind the line of scrimmage, those types of things that you could see the college offensive coordinator really force-fed the best athlete on their offense, right? And that works at the college level. It doesn't work at the NFL level, right? And so that's why, in the past, I faded Rondale Moore, Kadarius Toney, and I think Savion Williams is kind of the next guy in that run. Malachi Corley was that guy last year to avoid fading, and I found with that manufactured production, sometimes it's who you don't take just as much as who you do take.
Well, that's encouraging to hear because I just had a 4-round mock out on the site. Obviously, the second volume of our rookie guide came out. In the rookie guide, those guys, they do make an appearance because they are expected, obviously, to be picked in a range where maybe just the draft capital holds them. Although I guess I'm more skeptical on that maybe than most people. You got to really, really go down to find even one of them in my 4-round mock. Matt, when we're looking at really all prospects, but in the wide receiver show here, because we are still dealing with some of the aftermath of COVID, and then obviously you're in this new transfer era, the NIL era, who had the most interesting journey in the new context that all of these prospects, all of these recruits, even starting out, have found themselves in over the last 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, such a good question. I love this question. I'm gonna give a real answer, and then I'm gonna give a little bit of a bonus answer here as the second part. But my main answer is Matthew Golden, right? You're looking at somebody who started 2 years at Houston, was really flying under the radar in kind of a funky Houston offense too. But somebody who was relevant enough and who did produce early enough where he was on Devy radars. And before he went to Texas, I have Matthew Golden shares at Devy and Campus to Canton leagues back from when he was at Houston. And then he makes that jump up to Texas, which I don't think would necessarily be, now that feels so normal and so natural in the post NIL context. But before this transfer portal broke wide open, which it wasn't at the start of Matthew Golden's career, the idea of a Houston wide receiver going to Texas and then leading his offense and then propelling himself to being a, almost consensus first round NFL draft pick, it's really a wild concept. And it's almost more wild because it feels somewhat normal at this point in time. And it's only been a few years of this wide open offense. But I said I would give a bonus answer. And I just think it's worth considering. I don't think he gets enough respect for it. You look at Luther Burden. He was a 5-star recruit. He could have gone anywhere he wanted out of high school. He chose to stay home. He chose to play at Missouri. It was a questionable scheme choice, but he still came out, produced excellent as a freshman. And he, at that point, could have transferred really anywhere in the country. Again, he chose to stick with the team he committed to and played 3 years at Missouri. And now I think folks are almost knocking him for that. But I do think that's a strength in terms of what NFL teams are looking for and the type of guy that they want to add to their roster as well. So, kind of both ends of that spectrum.
You did mention Travis Hunter at the start, so we are going to ask the question, is he going to play on offense? Do you think he's going to be drafted by a team that sees him more as a wide receiver or a cornerback? Because that's the first part of this question before I get into the second part.
Yeah, isn't it wild, too, that I didn't answer Travis Hunter for that last question? That probably would have been worth consideration. If folks don't remember, he flipped on commitment day from Florida State to Jackson State. And then, of course, went over to Colorado. With Travis Hunter, where I'm working his projection right now, and I mean, you guys know, like truly we're guessing, right? Until we know the landing spot, we're guessing a little bit. But for me, I'm expecting him to play primarily as a defensive back. And then I'm going 20% offense. That's what I'm considering him. And so for me, that works out to about 5 or 6 targets a game. If he can get 5 or 6 targets a game on offense, given his skill set, all right, let's say that's 3 to 4 catches. He is the type of guy who could have a good ADOT, right? So he could be, let's say, 13.5 to 14 yards per reception. That's going to put us in a situation where if he scores a touchdown that week, he's a wide receiver too. He's a really good play in your lineup. If he doesn't score a touchdown that week, maybe it's 40 yards and it's not that good of a PPR play, right? So he's somebody for me right now. He falls in my rankings as wide receiver 4 using that approach because his athleticism and talent is so good. You really can't drop him much further because he's going to get the draft capital. The tape review is great, but the actual projection is a big part of my formula as well. And that's where I'm hesitating with him. But I mean, he's going to play some wide receiver. I have to feel confident in that.
Yeah, Shawn convinced me a couple of weeks ago that he has to play some part of offense, basically because that's what he wants to do. And why would a team take him early in the draft if they basically want to get on his bad side early in his career? So with him, you mentioned the 20% offense. It's going to be interesting because where you're ranking him and where he's going to be by consensus is going to lead to situations where if that upticks to 40% or even 50%, then you have potentially the wide receiver 1 on your hands with the ability that he has. So that leads into the question of, is McMillan, maybe he's not free, but is he the easy wide receiver 1 based then trying to take that context in as well for Hunter? And I do notice in your background, you do have Malik Neighbors' jersey in the background. So we are looking for, who is going to absolutely crush this season when they come through here as a rookie. Is that going to be McMillan?
Yeah, Malik Neighbors was a nice hit last year, so we had to get the jersey. With McMillan, for me, he's locked into my wide receiver 1, and he is a full tier above Luther Burden and Matthew Golden, who are tier 2, and then Travis Hunter is actually at the top of tier 3. So there is a pretty big gap for me. But that being said, and I'll talk about Tet here in a second, but with Hunter, you bring up a really good point in terms of, I am right now drafting him, I'm valuing him at the idea of 6 targets a game, but The one thing to consider is he wasn't coached up to play wide receiver at all at the college level, right? So you could put him in an NFL offense where he's actually going to wide receiver meetings and a wide receiver coach is actually developing him as a route runner. And then his potential is through the ceiling. So I don't blame folks who want to put Travis Hunter in that same tier as Tet McMillan. But in general, I feel like McMillan is just getting totally, left out of the narrative. And I get it because we've known he's been good for so long, folks get bored, but I'm telling you, when we come back to draft weekend, when we come back to that time, I think folks are going to be really excited about McMillan. We're talking about a guy who's 6'4", 220. He's very fast for his size. He's got good vertical athleticism and good lateral ability, a good lateral movement for his size. I think he's a really clean route runner. He attacks the ball. He wins at the catch point, but he doesn't rely on his size. Excellent ball tracking late. Again, if you don't watch college football, I cannot properly describe to you just how poor of a quarterback Noah Fifita was, the Arizona quarterback. And, again, if you want to talk character, if you want to talk about guys who are really loyal, McMillan absolutely could have transferred anywhere after the 2023 season at Arizona. When his coach left, Jed Fisher left to go to Washington, one of the main reasons he stayed at Arizona was because Noah Fifita was his high school quarterback. They're tight. They wanted to play together. And, he really, I think, took a bit of a sacrifice. He was the one giving up on that side of the relationship. So I love McMillan. I still think he's a top 10 pick. And he's the type of guy, when you plug him into a projection sheet, he's coming in at least 90 targets right off the bat, 6-7 touchdowns. And I'm saying that's not even if it's a high volume, if he gets an even better landing spot, high volume offense with good touchdown potential, he could be even higher than that.
And I mentioned the Neighbors conversation. Obviously, last year you had Harris and Neighbors, even Adunze in that conversation. If he was in that group of, Neighbors and Harrison, where would you be fitting him in there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Marv was my wide receiver 1 last year. And in my formula, he was an 8.6. So a scale of 1 to 10, he was an 8.6. Neighbors was an 8.5. McMillan's coming in as an 8.4. So below Neighbors, but very close. Certainly very different skill sets. But just in terms of, where the wide receiver 1 is this year, he would have been the wide receiver 3 last year.
Shawn's just trying to, get all that excitement after hearing you talk about McMillan out of his system before he starts talking.
Well, I walked into the Arizona softball game last weekend, and he walked in right in front of me, was shaking hands with the facility staff, all of those folks. And he just looked like a comic book superhero. Huge smile, just like you think.
You had a huge smile, or he had a huge smile?
Well, everybody's smiling. Everybody's smiling. It was awesome to see. We have him and Ginty separated out as the tier 1 in the rookie guide. I feel like we were all tempted to actually put him at the very top, but we also just have obviously immense respect for Ginty as well. Is it viable to have McMillan as the overall number 1 player in this class? And, especially tactically, say if you either finish last or if you're an FFPC RB Triflex League and you won the back draw and now you have the 101 and the 201, you would go with McMillan because the 201 is going to be a better running back than wide receiver. Just how you just mentioned 8.6, 8.5, 8.4, but how high can we put this guy who, again, he just looks extraordinary, and then you adjust for the context like you mentioned.
Yeah. So up until I adjusted Genty's draft capital recently, I really gave him a nice bump. It seems like he's probably going top 15. Until I adjusted his draft capital, McMillan was my overall 1. And so I would say the first, I mentioned I start my process, it's year round. So I start my process in July. And it wasn't until January, actually February, where Ginty passed McMillan in my rankings. So, for a long time, I was making the argument of McMillan. as the 101. And I still think you're in a position where you can choose the positional need that you have, right? If you're looking good at running back and you want to add McMillan and you have a format that requires you to start, say, 3 wide receivers, and you see the value in that, absolutely confident with that. And that's not to say, after we get landing spots and I plug in actual projections for these guys, it's not to say that McMillan won't finish above Genty at the end of the day here.
So we got to get to the next group. We got a lot more guys here. Luther Burden, you mentioned him already. Jayden Higgins, Matthew Golden, Emeka, Egbuka. Some analysts have these guys pretty far apart. Some have them closer together. Higgins is the guy that I recently moved up just an absolute ton. I was a little skeptical. I was concerned that maybe this is one of those, I mean, he's not like a big guy, but one of those bigger wide receivers who's going to have good numbers in college and then not be able to get open, not really do a ton at the NFL level. I came around on that fairly quickly, which we'll interested to see if that ends up being right or wrong. Matt, start us out looking at this group with a controversial take.
Oh, that's good, with a controversial take. For me, my big thing here is I think we're really overthinking Luther Burden, man. And I cannot believe it's a controversial take at this point, but I feel like we do this every March. We get bored. We've got to find a narrative. We've got to find something spicy to do. And this idea that Luther Burden isn't a top 20 draft pick is just baffling for me, man. This idea that his production dropped last season, so he's not any good. He is a really fantastic route runner, excellent release, separates consistently. He wins over the middle of the field. He's 6'0", 206, but he's not limited to the slot. You can absolutely put him in a flanker role. I mean, this is a guy you can plug into a spreadsheet for 80 to 100 targets and have a 68, 69% catch percentage on that. That's a really nice spot to be in. And I've seen him fall as far as wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 or 5 in some rankings. I think that's ridiculous. For me, he really is locked into wide receiver 2. I don't know what it is. If it's boredom, like I said, or we're just really overthinking it here with Luther Burden.
On him, he seems to be one of the best guys with the ball in his hands in the last 5, 6 years, decade, what have you. Obviously, Malik Neighbors was that. There was a little bit of concern. I mean, Neighbors was the guy that I liked the best out of last year's class. It's easy to say that now and be really excited about it. Obviously, that could have been wrong. Burden is a guy here who, again, just so extraordinary when he has the ball. But you mentioned earlier this concern about if the production is manufactured. I think that's a concern that people have. One of the things that I've written up several times based on the SIS numbers is that his number of catchable deep targets really cratered in the final season. We know that maybe even much more extreme version of what McMillan was dealing with, that the quarterback essentially can't get the job done at all. But how much, you mentioned the route running, and so obviously there's not the concern for you. Basically, your message to people would be, this is not remotely manufactured production. Just because he is good with the ball in his hands, don't worry about that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because he is a good yak player and he is good with his hands, good with the ball in his hands after the catch, but it's not the way he relies on winning. It really is his hands. It's his route running ability. It's his speed. And I'm not drawing a one-to-one comparison between these two players, but the guy he reminds me of in terms of value is CeeDee Lamb, because CeeDee Lamb was an excellent yards after catch receiver in college as well, but he didn't need it to win. And you'll see he'll have some great plays after the catch now in the NFL, but it's not the way that he relies on winning. And I see a lot of comparisons there between him and Burden.
So the two players in this group that are pretty weird to me, and you've already spoken glowingly of Golden, but I guess I have a hard time understanding how you have Egbuka, you have Golden. These guys play in 1 billion games because of the new format, and we're talking like barely 1,000 receiving yards. Why is that the wrong way to look at their production? One thing I would note is that even though these guys play a lot of games and their teams are very good, their quarterbacks probably are pretty bad. Because you're playing for Texas, you're playing for Ohio State, those quarterbacks may get drafted. They'll probably be overdrafted. in terms of, again, what SIS would suggest in the charting, they're actually not very good quarterbacks, especially Ewers. But I mean, you've got to get, and maybe more even, especially Egbuka than Golden. I mean, you've got to get some yards. What are you doing here? I'm almost certainly wrong about this, but I definitely don't get it.
No, I certainly see where we're coming from, especially with Egbuka, right? There's an argument to be said, look at the wide receivers that he's played with in college, coming out of Ohio State the last few years. It's really incredible. And so, but he's been playing since his freshman year, right? So he's shared the wide receiver room with Marvin Harrison Jr. He's shared the wide receiver room with Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson. I'm forgetting about a big Ohio State wide receiver. I'm sure I'll get shamed about that later. But, you can make an argument that, like, all right, you understand why he's always been the second or third option on his team. But this year, he really did have the ability to step up and be the wide receiver one. And although he was a really good player, he wasn't the wide receiver one, right? He was true freshman Jeremiah Smith. And, that's a totally different conversation. And again, hard to argue that you can't be as good as, with the idea of, a player just not being as good as Jeremiah Smith. But with Egbuka, for me, and he's wide receiver 6, and I like him, but he's wide receiver 6 in my rankings. I just want folks to proceed with a realistic expectation for him, right? He's a high floor guy. He's not a high ceiling guy. I think he can come in. He can be a really good low-end wide receiver 2 for you, and that's not a bad spot to be, right? Especially if you can draft him in the early second round. But that's what he's always been at the college level, right? He's always been an underneath type guy. My biggest knock on him is we don't have examples of him consistently winning deep, but he's a high possession wide receiver. And if you put him in a high volume passing attack in the NFL, then you could feel a little bit more bullish on consistent, a wide receiver 2 weeks from him. But I think at worst case scenario, he's a solid flex option in your lineup.
Next up, we'll come to Jalen Royals, and somebody who's not a small receiver at 6 foot. Always interested in the different calculuses of how we're measuring these things. Inches, feet, centimeters, meters, pounds, kilograms. It all gets a bit confusing for me, and sometimes I have to.
Always wants to do it in stone and hands.
Yeah, I'm always like, let me just Google what this actually is. How can I understand what this is? But yeah, most of the time it does eventually work out. I'm having trouble at the moment. I'm like trying to lose some weight, but my scales are in kilograms. I like to talk about, like, as Shawn mentioned, stone. Then I'm like, what's that in pounds if I'm trying to compare it to some of these players? So it's all over the place at the moment. But Jalen Royals, he has his elite first step, early route, athleticism. With everything that we've seen so far, could he be a star at the NFL level, hence becoming a fantasy football star?
Yeah, I like Jalen Royals a lot. I'm glad you mentioned his first step. I think he's probably got the best first step in the class. He's fast, and we saw that at the combine. But more impressive to me is how quickly he accelerates. He gets to that top speed very quickly, and that helps him consistently win in his routes, especially in the short field. But he's somebody, he played on the outside at Utah State, and so he was a boundary wide receiver. I think you're probably moving him split in the NFL, right? Because he is I don't think he has that X type of body build for the NFL, but he absolutely was an X receiver in that Utah State offense. Great production. And then he went to the combine and ran a 4.42, right? And I think that really locked in the idea that he was a day 2 player. It's really easy to look at Jalen Royals, Utah State, who did they play? Well, we do at least have the Boise State tape, and he looked fantastic against Boise State. Say what you want about, the fact that they were in the college football playoff, but that was a team that finished in the top 4 in terms of the college football playoff ranking. So he put together good tape against a good team, and the best team that he was asked to put good tape against. So,
and by good tape, you mean 211 yards and 2 touchdowns.
Yeah, not bad, right? Not bad.
Pretty good.
Trey Harris versus Ayomanor here. I put these guys together, interested to hear if you think that these guys would be in the same range when you're thinking about them, if they have some size or stylistic similarities. Who do you like better, but also could both of them be undervalued?
I really like that you're talking about these two guys together because I do think that they will get similar ADPs. I like Ayomanor a lot more. So for him, I think he's going to end up a really good value because there's so many, guys, I think the biggest winner of anybody at the combine was the middle of the wide receiver group. Because I think we had a lot of risers. You mentioned Higgins earlier, right? And these guys are going to be packed together. And so you're going to have to make choices as to, do you like Jalen Royals? Do you like Jayden Higgins? Do you like Ayomanor? Do you like Harris? And that's going to be the back end of the second round. And so in some leagues, you're going to get Ayomanor in the third round because of this, just based on, who your league mates like. And I think you're going to get a really awesome wide receiver at that point. He's a super clean route runner, a little under the radar because he's been playing at Stanford, but excellent hands. I love his ball tracking ability. That for me is where he would stand out if we're comparing him 1-to-1 against Trey Harris. A few more points on where they stand out, but that's the biggest one for me, I should say. I mentioned his good hands, and at the end of the day, in his back pocket, Ayomanor has the trump card of he went up against Travis Hunter and he cooked him. He's got really awesome tape against Travis Hunter, and I do think that's helping kind of propel his fantasy stock. And I wouldn't doubt if there's an NFL team, cutting up film right now, studying these prospects. They're watching him against Travis Hunter and say, that's enough for me. Like, we're taking him as a top 50 pick, but I think he'll be a day 2 pick. I also, I think Trey Harris could go day 2. For me, I think he's a little bit more of a day 3 pick. It's really, really tough for us to get into that Ole Miss offense and feel confident about what we're seeing, right? It is such a pass-friendly, wide receiver-friendly offense that when you're looking at Trey Harris and you see some examples of his big plays, he tends to be wide open. It's blown coverage. You don't see him really consistently separating at a high level through his routes. And so his route running for me is a big drop-off compared to a guy like Ayomanor, who I think is a little bit more technically refined. I also mentioned that ball tracking ability. And again, it's not that Harris doesn't do it well. Like, he does a lot of things well. Overall, his tape profile is good, but he doesn't have a standout trait for me. And when a wide receiver doesn't have a key standout trait, it just it gives me pause in terms of, how do I project this guy? How do I actually put him in an NFL offense? And, again, over the last couple of years, those Ole Miss wide receivers, they've struggled to fit into NFL offenses. So maybe it's a slower transition as opposed to him not hitting at all. But I'm proceeding with caution on Trey Harris.
So you've already mentioned Noel. We've got to keep moving along, so I'm not going to ask you to do a ton on him, but I am interested in this idea of where you think he might go now. I mean, you mentioned you're extremely high on him. He's one of my favorite sleepers, not actually a sleeper now. I probably have him too low in the article that I just put out based on some of the things you're saying. Noel versus kind of the non-producer in Isaiah Bond, another very fast guy. Just because they're both fast doesn't mean they're stylistically similar. Well, the draft slot on these two guys, do you have a sense of where you think that would be? And then, like, over, under, in terms of, are they both going to beat draft position? Are they both, I mean, you've already mentioned you don't think Noel's going to necessarily underperform that. How are we looking at these guys relative to where you see them going?
Yeah, so I think in terms of NFL draft, I think Noel picks 21 to 50. That's my draft capital bucket there. And then I think Bond's going to be a late day 2 pick at this point in time. It's really, really hard to sit here and tell you that somebody who ran a 4.39 ran a disappointing 40, but Bond kind of needed to run a 4.29. It's kind of wild, but when you watch the first half of his Texas film this past season and then his 2023 film, you see somebody with really excellent hands who wins with more than just speed. And then his second half of 2024 film was just so bad. I think it's just raised a lot of red flags for not just me, but across the board. And that's why I think you're not hearing folks talk about Isaiah Bond much, even though he did run a 4.39. And so, I think that he's going to really struggle to get that draft capital. And in terms of rookie draft projection, then I think Noel's going to end up being a early to mid second round rookie pick in Superflex league. So let's say somewhere between 202 and 206 in that range, where I think Bond, he fits into that tier that I was just talking about with Higgins, with Ayomanor, with Trey Harris, where it's going to be a choose your flavor. And I think it could result in him having, an early third round ADP. So kind of a flip from what we would have expected earlier on in this draft process between those two guys.
You mentioned Savion Williams earlier in the show, so these two next guys kind of probably fall into a similar game as him with sleeper or trap. So we have Jack Bech and then Xavier Restrepo. Are they players that should be classed as sleepers, or are they fantasy landmines?
Yeah, Bech is a trap for me. You know, I really do not see him holding more than 60 targets in a season at the NFL level. Again, really fun tape. But I just think he's not going to return that type of value for you. And I think, you know, there's some people who might take him in the second round of rookie drafts. I really think it's going to be a tough spot to be in. Xavier Restrepo, I like Restrepo, and I like it because I can see a very defined role for him. I think he's going to be a slot receiver, but at 5'10", 209, I think he could be a really physical slot receiver. And at Miami, you'll see in his tape, he wins over the middle of the field. He's physical. He's comfortable winning in traffic. He holds on through contact, and he's able to separate at the bottom of his route tree. And so I think that's going to be a good role for him to be in. Now, 3 years ago, if I told you that there was a physical big slot wide receiver, you wouldn't be excited about that idea. But we've seen the formula where in today's NFL, that can win, right? I mean, even look at what Josh Downs is able to do. When he's got a quarterback that's not destroying his fantasy value. Xavier Restrepo, I think, can win and produce in a similar way to how Josh Downs does it.
Hopefully, it doesn't end up with the Colts.
At this point, who knows?
The receivers were pretty insane at the combine, but specifically the guys who are not good. Which is helpful because if you're not good, then you need to be fast. So in this next group I'm about to list like super quick, we have a couple guys we actually really like, but mostly we added this group into that 50 to 60 range in the rookie guide in order to make sure people were aware that we did see the combine, right? but that they didn't do anything. Who do we need to know about? Are any of these guys actual receivers? Ty Felton, Kyle Williams, Lambert Smith, Lane, Nair, Brown, Smith, Thornton, DK.
You got one of my favorite sleepers in this group here. I love Ty Felton. Out of Maryland. When I watch his tape, I see a really twitchy guy. I see somebody who separates consistently. I was not shocked when he crushed the combine because you can see the athleticism and speed on tape. Really good hands. Adjusts well to off-target balls. And let me tell you guys, I was talking down Noah Fafita earlier. Noah Fafita, compared to Billy Edwards, who is the quarterback at Maryland, I mean, he looks like a Heisman, trophy candidate. The quarterback play at Maryland was so bad. And I understand what I'm about to say is lazy because they both wore the Maryland uniform. But when I watch Ty Felton, I just see a little bit of DJ Moore. Just in terms of the way he wins, I really do see that type of athletic, sure-handed receiver, and somebody who I wouldn't be shocked if he goes day 2 and ruins our sleeper potential here on him. But I think he could go day 3 and just be a steal in the 3rd or 4th round of rookie drafts. You can kind of miss me on the rest of the group, to be honest with you. A little bit of interest in Kyle Williams because I think he had really good hands and was a good possession guy. But it'd have to be the right landing spot, the right offense. A little bit with Jaylen Lane, the athleticism's there. He's explosive, but he falls a lot. I don't know how to quantify that. He trips himself up a lot, which is weird. The rest of the guys I think are fine. Oh, you know what? I will take that back. Arian Smith out of Georgia was somebody who did actually pop on tape for me. I thought he played very well downfield specifically. He was able to separate. He was able to react well to off-target balls. Overall, he's got good hands, and he's a pretty clean route runner. So I would say Felton, Smith, Kyle Williams in that order are the guys who jump out to me from this group.
As you were talking about Felton, I was looking up to see where I had put him, and it's fairly enthusiastic. We do like him. He's the guy that we like.
Nice.
Having said all of that, we want to give you a chance to get the soundbite out there that 8 months from now you can parade around everywhere. Ty Felton would be like the wide receiver 4 when everything's said and done.
Wide receiver 4 overall?
Yeah.
That would be amazing. You're saying, how does he get there?
No, it just if you wanted to make the claim that he was wide receiver 4, we're going to give you the platform right here to make that statement.
I gotcha. All right, here's the idea. So, I mean, there is a world. There is a world where Ty Felton works, and he could be a top 5 wide receiver in terms of this draft class. And that world is you put him as a flanker receiver in a high volume offense where you've got a really nice X to pull top coverage from him. And then you let him work underneath at a 90% target rate. And again, with his hands and his athleticism, you could get a 12.5, 13 yards per reception, 70% catch rate. Those numbers are going to start adding up, 6 or 7 touchdown type season. There's a world where it works out that Felton could be a top 5 guy.
Love it.
The one thing we have to mention is over the last couple of seasons, Shawn has kind of put that out for people to say, and it has had a huge hit rate in terms of like last year's was Brock Bowers, Jayden Daniels. So we're not putting any pressure on Ty Felton, but you need to come through this season.
I'm here for it. I've been riding the Puka hit too long. I need a new late round wide receiver.
We need him to come through here. So the last one on wide receivers is some of the lower profile producers. Any of them interesting for you with Torrey Holton, Pat Bryant, Ricky White, or Nick Nash?
I got to tell you, man, I think the guy I get asked the most questions about in my Discord is Torrey Holton. And like, I think he's a special teamer, so I'm just going to say that. The guy who I do like out of this group is Ricky White. And the reason I like Ricky White, and he's at a UNLV, and he's a good route runner. He's got good hands. I thought he's got pretty decent speed, and he can separate well. But the tape that we have on him is Power 5 competition. So I'm remembering he went against Syracuse this year, and he had another. It was Syracuse and another top team here, Oregon State. And so when I watched his tape, he played up really well to that level of competition. And I like when Power 4 guys play up against higher level competition. So good hands, overall, a pretty well-rounded prospect. Another guy who's got a little bit of yak potential, a little bit of yards after catch potential to him, but I think is just getting lost in a really strong middle tier of this wide receiver group. So probably day 3 guy, but worth looking at.
So that is going to close out the wide receiver edition. We did mention at the end of the previous episode when we talked running backs about the rookie big board. Matt, over at Patreon is where the listeners can find it.
Yeah, absolutely. Patreon.com/rookie big boards. That's rookie rankings, rookie draft guide, rookie big board Discord. Also on YouTube, we're doing our annual rookie profile series. So about a 10-minute clip on all the top prospects. We're up to 28 now, and we'll push into the 30s. So if you want kind of rapid reactions to some of the top guys in the class, we're doing tape, we're doing stats, we're doing the whole 9 yards on those guys. So both of those are really good spots to get more rookie content from me.
And you can follow him as well on X. I'm starting to get around to calling it X as well. So at the FF_educator, you can check me out on socials at Overtime Ireland, and you can find all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. We are going to circle back to talk quarterback and tight end. So make sure you're subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get that once it is available. Until we are back, have a good one.